Oh, hi everyone.
Hello, everyone. Hello,
Greetings
everyone.
from Wiltshire. I can't see you, but I hope you can see, well, poor things. You might be able to see me, which is not such good news. And you can see the squalor, but it's Harwood HQ. With lots and lots of, and the C20 architects and the journals are in that bit either side of the CDs over there, just so you know. And Peter can nod.
Right.
Not like you're out in the wilds of the countryside. Is that Pimlico? Is that Chateau Pimlico vibe?
That's absolutely right. That's the creeper out of control down the back of the building.
It looks fabulous.
Yeah, I thought people would be fed up, got fed up from the other view. Anyway, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of lectures. I'm Peter Rubach. I'm chairman of the 20th Century Society, and if you don't know this already, we're the organisation that campaigns to protect the best post-1914 architecture and design, as well as having an educational remit. We're a member organisation, we're a charity. You can find more about us on the Society's webpage, including how to join and in detail how we do casework and other activities and all sorts of information about how we're organised. Really, without further ado, it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Elain Harwood, distinguished architectural historian, especially of the post-war period. And who's going to talk about mid-century architecture.
Sorry about that, Peter. I didn't mean to put you off your stride. It's so rare.
Okay, over to you.
Come along. There we go. It has this knack of putting up you are screen sharing right where you want to press slideshow play from start. There we are. Can you see it, everybody? If Peter can see it, then you all can. Give us a thumbs up, Peter. Good. So, obviously the Festival of Britain. You're going to see a lot more of this later, but it's the perfect introductory slide for that butterfly roof coming straight out of Le Corbusier, the lettering, the open tread staircase, and of course Daphne Henrien's figure of youth, which I can't imitate, poised just below. Work by Leonard Manasseh, who won a competition for a restaurant that then got scrapped for lack of money, and he got to do this bar over the top of the loos and the security office and all the bits they couldn't squeeze in anywhere else, and I think he made a dab show of it. Alan last week started with the very slide I was already intending to start with this week, so I wasn't going to be put off. Lane House in Sussex by Marcel Boer shows the posh, the 30s proper modern movement, the international style of largely concrete, some sneaky bits of rendered brick accepted, and the pilotis and the flat roofs. And Alan showed you how by the end of the decade, first Breuer and then York himself got absolutely fed up of trying to get services into concrete roofs to cope with the staining of white concrete in a British climate. And this terrace of brewery cottages exemplifies the way architecture was going if the Second World War hadn't got in the way. Stratford-on-Avon. So you can see here some cheap bits of offcuts of Cotswold stone for the end wall brick, but can you see that roof is a monopitch, very Danish in style, with the overhang and the simple modern style of a terrace for brewery workers otherwise known as Mayflower Green. his father, also an architect, was the architect to Flowers Bloom. And look at that date, 1944. This was a weekend cottage. York entertained his mistress there. Mrs. York found out and he was obliged to sell up. But it got the permission through at the time of building licenses by claiming that this was a pilot scheme for prefabrication. But you can see again, it's stone in a concrete frame. The blue is painted brick. So very cheap and cheerful, very austerity, incredibly simple. And if you know Stevenage, the caretaker's cottage at Berkeley School, just York, Rosenberg and Mardell's first major school, is very similar to this. So other sort of sources for this change of direction, the pioneers described by no less than Dennis Lasdon in 1954 as the seminal building of the 1930s. You see the date there, 1930, 31. Because again, it's using stone from a local quarry as well as posh stone or concrete, reconstituted stone. I think this is really, but you've got the pilotti getting a bit chunky there, pilotti, the flat roof, and all the ingredients that Alan talked about last week, about the 5 points that Le Corbusier said that modern architecture had: the flat roof, the strip window, the free plan, the free facade, the pilotti. Yeah, I haven't missed one. I thought I had. There's that curve of the roof again, which Manasseh was imitating with his 51 bar. And Mary Crowley in Orchard Road in Turin, there's 3 houses for members of her family and a family friend, again very much inspired by Denmark, which she visited, and it's just like the York Brewery cottages, but on a larger scale and detached. They are large, aren't they? Really double fronted. Other sources. This is Frank Lloyd Wright is really not terribly well known in Britain until the end of the 1930s. I think when I gave the talk on Art Deco some months ago, I made the point that Willem Dudok, the Wright's follower in the Netherlands, was far better known in Britain than Wright himself. By the end of the 30s, that's beginning to change. And Wright's scheme of Usonian, USA houses, houses for the American nation, this term Usonian, you can almost imagine that S being a capital S, start to show that you could do simple modern buildings in brick. This is a concrete slab. It's a modern recreation one at Florida Southern College near Tampa, where Wright built extensively. But you can see his influence on Robert Townsend in particular down in Wiltshire. This is Townsend's own house, a big double height living room with a surgery wing. Mrs. Townsend was a doctor and a member of the Wilton's carpet factory, and they so it's quite a long, narrow house, but Townsend was obsessed with Wright and organised one of the first exhibitions of his work in Britain in Bath, where he had an office in the 1950s. And Robert Harvey corresponded with Wright before and during the war, and went down to hear him lecture in London when he appeared here in 1950. Wright visited London 3 times, 1939, 1950, and then when he was famous shortly before his death. But you can see here, this is a modern building. Yes, it's sort of, it's getting quite expressive. It's not like that white box, but the stone is doing all sorts of stony things, isn't it? It's being very characterful. These roofs can, again, look like a sort of imaginary sort of child's house, I think. It always has that sort of slightly witch-like quality. And then you've got the big concrete balconies. And Harvey and his family built this pretty much themselves. And even Alva Aalto with the Villa Maria look to Frank Lloyd Wright and admits that this house was to some extent inspired by what Wright was doing. I think once you know that, you can see there are similarities as well as similarities in the landscape between Scandinavia and the American, the prairies. Equally dull, but one has trees and one doesn't. Stockholm exhibition 1930 is really where this change, this different modernism starts to become apparent. And if you look at the Stockholm exhibition, which is when Scandinavia goes modern in the hands of Gunnar Asplund, architect of Stockholm, Lloyd, previously one of the greatest classicists, you start to see many of the ingredients that reappear in the Festival of Britain. The use of colour. If you specify blue, you get a blue. The tower there. And this is the book on the Stockholm exhibition, and this picture here showing that radar tower with a domed auditorium behind it. There's the fairground. It's a big site, as you can see, and it's away from the city centre. You can see Stockholm Town Hall back there and Gamlestadt and all the other little islands there. And if you go to Stockholm, you see today it's still dominated by the town hall, which was incredibly influential on all styles really through the 20s and 30s, and the copper cupola, the weather vane, the clock tower, these attenuated windows appear post-war. And I think if the money had been around, there would have been a lot more of this Swedish grace around continuing in Britain. And it's only because the funding had gone that more universities weren't like this. And the University Grants Committee encouraged them to build modern, because you could build a modern building in sections and it wasn't so obvious if a wing was missing. Town halls continue this style, such as Newcastle. And I put the Carl Millis sculpture in there. There's another one there, but you may not have noticed that sculpture plays an enormous part on the waterfront and in the streets and parks of Stockholm, even today. And if you go to its new town, or it's not quite a new town, but it's more than a suburb. It's more like Thamesmead. It's as big as a town, but it's within the Stockholm city boundary. Veringby, Backstrom and Renius, a whole new development at the end of the main green underground line. Here's the fantastic cinema, the granite sets in swirling patterns. Note the tower block for later, all coloured tiles, lots of fantastic lettering, and so on and so forth. Brazil, a new source of architecture that begins to be recognised in the middle of the war, because Brazil is still building during the war. It's neutral till 1943. It has the same year that there's an exhibition called Brazil Builds at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and this is the catalogue. And you see in buildings like Oscar Niemeyer's circle of modern buildings round a lake at Pampulha. It's a sort of inland lake resort, really, with boating and a casino, and then the church to make you feel better if you won or lost, I suppose. With concrete in the great arch of a shell concrete vault, decorated with murals and tiles and this fantastic tower you can just see there. Miami. Now, I've called this mid-century modern. I first heard that term used with regard to Miami modern, which is the term for the style of its larger hotels as you go up Cousins Avenue, north of Ocean Drive, up towards the North Beach. And there's a group of massive hotels, 1,000-room hotels built from the late 1940s, like the Casablanca, with those rather lovely Atalantes holding up the canopy. And then the Eden Rock, Morris Lapidus, Ukrainian Jewish origins, New York architect to shops and interior designer to the rich and famous, now famous really for these series of hotels like the Eden Rock and the Fontainebleau. In Britain, we tend to call it the festival style, or sometimes the contemporary style, which was really very sort of disparaging term when used by people like Theo Crosby in the 1950s. And it was Leslie Jackson's book, Contemporary, in 1994 that resurrected the term and made it not more than acceptable, but all right. But now we do tend to use the American mid-century modern because it can refer to what was beginning to happen before the war, as well as what happens in the 1950s into the early 1960s. But the thing that makes it really different in this country is looking at the English landscape. Now, I've halted here with this postcard of the Exposition Internationale in Paris of 1937. I'm looking down from the Palais de Chaillot, which was built for that exhibition and which is now the Museum of Art in Paris, looking towards poor old Eiffel Tower being beheaded. But you see here the German pavilion, looking at the Nazi pavilion, of course, looking at Stalin's Soviet pavilion, very little difference in styles, as Osbert Lancaster separately observed, the straight military planning of the two forces facing each other. This is very much the symbol of that exhibition. Now, during the war, you see in the British architectural press, and particularly the Architectural Review, apologies for the lack of italic there, there's a whole series of articles celebrating the Englishness of English art, the picturesque movement, which you see on the left here. There's November. By December 1944, they're looking at the work of Capability Brown. You see Dorothy Stroud publishes her book on Brown, 1944. It's about falling apart, that one. The Renaissance of the English Public House by Basil Oliver, 1943. The works of Thomas Sharp, a leading town planner, who's talking about the picturesque and the whole Englishness of the scene. I hope you can just see this cover underneath me there. And even the city plans for the future. There's Durham, there's Oxford. They're looking at the old as well as the new, rather slightly different from Goldfinger's interpretation of Forshaw and Abercrombie's County of London plan with that fabulous dancing penguin. But I put it there as a reminder of how well read people were in the war. These books, Sharp's Town Planning, County of London plan, sold numbers I could die for. You know, they sold millions. And this, okay, was think this was true in maybe 3 and 6. That was 9p. You know, this serious books had their place. People were genuinely interested in the future of Britain, but there's also of let's look at the Britain that we're fighting for. Let's look at the what makes us different. You know, the book John Piper talking about pubs and talking about the sort of vernacular in a more architectural review articles really says it all. I mentioned the Stockholm exhibition, even closer to the Festival of Britain, the New York World's Fair with Trilon and the Perisphere here. A great image of it, because it's out at Flushing Meadow where they supposed to be playing tennis soon, rather than at Queen's, near the centre. So you needed a sort of tall symbol, and then next to it, a great dark exhibition space. But look how regimental and linear it still is. 1939, the photographers there for the opening. And look at the Festival of Britain site. The South Bank site was tiny, but it was central. They'd made the mistake of Wembley being too far out of town, and Wembley had flopped. Here, they had great site, partly cleared because the LCC had bought it in the 30s with the intention of shoving a road through to Charing Cross and Trafalgar Square. Partly, of course, war damage and proposals to develop this as a cultural centre. So that's a sort of coal mine exhibit by the Architects Co-Partnership, who do all this side entrance. I suppose the picture's being taken from a upper floor or scaffold outside County Hall. And here you have the Dome of Discovery, 365 feet in diameter, and there's the Skylon competition won by young architects Powell and Moyer. And there is the Royal Festival Hall, with behind it a shot tower of 1820 on the site of the Queen Elizabeth Hall that was adapted for the exhibition of Radar. There you see Skylon and the dome much better. It's sort of pastry confection, but it's the biggest aluminium building in the world. Skylon, like Britain, it had no visible means of support, as at the time said. You could see it sort of supported on a cat's cradle, like series of thin wires. And this concourse here, you're coming in through Gordon Tate's Lamella arched entrance down to this concourse by Jim or H.T. Cadbury Brown, which is where the dancing took place, with jets and gas lights giving light and panoramic views across Whitehall Court. This is one of Jim Cadbury Brown's own slides looking back the other way, and you can see this concourse. You can see the importance of the landscape with these pots by Maria Shepherd, again something that was very novel. And I think it's the first time that you've got a whole site filled with modern buildings. How old-fashioned the latest in steam engines looks by comparison. Architects here are on this transport exhibit, hard against the railway, and you basically did a loop around there under the arches and a loop around the other side, which was a little bit less coherent because the Festival Hall, the one building to be permanent, is in the way. Here's a postcard showing the back of it, with his back entrance by Trevor Dannett, who's still with us, aged 100. This is Canvas by Dennis Clark Hall. The landscaping, this grid of beds, and very, I suppose it goes back to the Villa Hyères and the 1920s, but also looking forward in its relative freedom and the way that landscaping and water, rather than fences, are used to create a barrier. You've got the Ernest raised chairs, you can see the shot tower, and all the memorabilia around coinciding with from Abraham, using Abraham Games as symbol based on Britannia. So a fusion again of old English tradition with something with compass points and bunting to make it look jocular, whether it's shot glasses, ashtrays, books. And this is the ad break. I've put my email on here. If anybody would like a copy of the Festival of Britain Journal, I have copies here in darkest Islington for a £5, plus I'm afraid £3.10 postage, but that would actually get you two. If there's any other journals you'd like, drop me a line. The postage is the same for one journal or two. End of ad. And here's the festival halt in the 50s. Poor old shot tower lingering on, and you can see the old facade, how bitty it was, usually credited to Robert Matthew, who did the original sketches of it. You can see the egg in the box more clearly before a new front was added. Designs based on later sketches by Leslie Martin. Whether Martin just wanted to eradicate Matthew's work because he thought it was a bit naive looking, and Martin's egg was something a bit more smooth. It's really hard to tell. There's no correspondence yet uncovered. Martin's papers have yet to be catalogued by the RIBA, so we've yet to find out. But here's the interior, which is the perfect, sublime, mid-century modern interior, much of it by Peter Moro, who was brought in on a short contract with the London County Council to, I suppose, be Martin's right-hand man and realise most of the interior. And Moro, in turn, brings in a team of 13 assistants. There's not much money. There's almost no time for this building. It had to be built in 3 years flat because without the concert hall, you couldn't have an exhibition of culture. And so it was all predicated that this building would be finished on the 3rd of May, 1951. So lots and lots of design, lots and lots of people doing detailing. See the Royal Box there, these boxes here looking a little bit like High Point 1, and Moro had worked for Rebecca on High Point 2 at the very least, and had grown up with that tecton philosophy. And Janet was one of his students, along with many, and Moro's friend Robin Day does the seating. It's an absolute cornucopia of mid-century design. And other places picked up on the theme. The point about the Abraham Games compass point thing was that it was the festival of Britain, not just the South Bank. Trowel, near where my mum lives, was the festival village on the Nottinghamshire-Derbyshire border. Bedfordshire, which you see here, the council voted that all its villages would have new village signs featuring the county coat of arms and the festival sign. Some of them have been redone, some of them, I think where you've got concrete posts, they're still the original signs. And what was the festival legacy? Some claim that it marked the end of a tradition, save in landscaping, where you see some modern landscaping, the use of pots, the use of indoor plants, the use of water and informal spacing starting to come to the fore. But I think you do see an influence in the variety of shapes, colour, material, art, simple, honest expression of different materials in architecture, and absolutely nowhere better than in Central Parade, Walthamstow, the real sort of favourite building of this kind of genre. So what have we got? We've got brick, we've got slate. I hope you can see this cursor. We've got the heraldics shields of the past burghers of Walthamstow, all the famous families, culminating in a mosaic depicting the borough coat of arms. We have a bank, we have shops under their wavy concrete canopy. It's a beautiful example of shell concrete. Look how thin that concrete is, but how solid, how it's working as a cantilever because it's got that trigonometry. And you've got pool pottery for the tiles, and of course, in the style of Stockholm Town Hall, this isn't a town hall, but it's the town centre, and it's got the community hall, and it's got the first, some of the important showcase flats of the bar. It's got the clock tower and the viewing platform. There's a community centre which has got different tiles, and there's garaging and access ways around the back and so forth. But there's also 50s, say, cornucopia is really the best word for it. Taylor and Green, architects, work-life couple, Herbert Taylor doing much of the design work and the landscaping, David Green realising it on site, doing the drains and the infrastructure, and also the final photographs, so the images that were published of their work. And apologies for that motor car. It would not shift. I tried going up to photograph this about 5 times recently. But this is a classic 1940 mid-century, very European looking house and studio. It's for artist who worked for Punch and was killed in the war. And so this up the living room and studio is the room at the top with the bedrooms down below, and then the kitchen workroom here, and the most fabulous roof terrace. After the war, they settle near Green. Green is a father was an architect in Lowestoft who died, and they took over the practice. They were initially doing a lot of war damage work, and you see with the crinkle crankle walls, the use of brick, the barge boards, the dates in the gable, how they're picking up elements of the local Suffolk vernacular, particularly this bendy crinkle crankle wall, and the patterns in the gables, which exaggerated, and there's a bit of Scandinavia. And they'd been to Germany, they'd studied the Frankfurt, the work of Ernst May, can't remember the name of the estates now. The sort of large estates of workers' housing that form as a ring on the north side of Frankfurt, and this they're reinterpreting in a sort of completely English way after the war. Again, doing schemes that could be built in sections as the money allowed. So this is 1955, but that end down there on the right-hand side was not added till 1957, but it's asymmetrical anyway, so it doesn't matter. And they're introducing this new feature of the old person's bungalow, which really hadn't been built until the Second World War, and changes to the health service and the way that old people were looked after. Stockholm had a boom of immigration during the Second World War, nominally neutral, but industrialised late, and people coming off the land to live in the city, and a lot of refugees. So building flats, and if you're going to build on granite like that, you've got to build well, because you don't want to have to demolish and rebuild. It's hard graft building in Scandinavia, so you do it well and you get it right first time, so you don't endlessly rebuild it. And these flats were seen by Oliver Cox, Graham Shanklin, Michael Ventris, who stayed in Stockholm for 6 months, Ventris getting a job there in 1950. Cox and Shanklin come back to work for the London County Council, and there you see an Alton East, the tall block of flats combined with family houses by having flats for single people and couples without children. You've got more land for family housing. You have this mixed development, which is very much a feature of the post-war, and you can make it picturesque and interesting. You don't need straight lines. When your road can follow the curve of the hill, you put the tower at the top so that it looks hillier. You put the tower where the old Victorian villa was, so you preserve the original trees. And the original trees being 19th century are very largely coniferous. You add a few granite rocks to make it look even more like Stockholm. I give you Alton East, 1952 to 5, roughly. The first point block was built by Frederick Gibbard in Harlow, 1950 to 51. This was Harlow's contribution to the Festival of Britain. And you can see those little sticky out headers there? Very Scandinavian feature. Monk bond, which Gibbard was very fond of. How the monks of Dewey Abbey in Berkshire think it's a great architectural joke that their monastery is constructed of monk bond. 2 stretchers for every header instead of the usual 3, which is English garden wall bond. Contrasted with blue Scandinavian tile render, you see how the butterfly plan means that all 4 flats on each floor get a partially south-facing balcony. 10 stories, say Britain's first point block. And Harlow also benefited from the Festival of Britain when the festival closed in September 1951. The Arts Council, which was responsible for the sculptures and murals, livened the site hugely, offered them to local authorities, Newtown Corporation, schools, anybody who could offer sculpture a good home. And almost nobody wanted the stuff. Harlow took Barbara Hepworth's contrapuntal forms and 3 murals. The London County Council took some murals for its schools. Manchester took a couple of pieces, but by and large, the stuff ended up scrapped. When Harlow, it became the sort of starting point for Harlow's great collection of sculpture developed by the Harlow Arts Trust from 1954 onwards. And they commissioned Meat Porters by Ralph Brown for the Market Square. This is Gibbard again, Adam's House, and again there's a very Scandinavian looking clock sitting there. But low, because you don't, the tall buildings of the flats at either end, sort of anchoring the town centre, and the demolished town hall down at the other. Here, it's deliberately kept low. And another source, we haven't talked about private houses, but in America, you can see instead where we've been using concrete and brick, it's cheap, it's affordable in America to build of steel. And in California, which is where the money is, then California had a very good war with the armaments industry, leaving behind lots of steel. We seem to have aluminium to play with. The John Intenza, editor of Arts and Architecture magazine, conceived the idea of case study houses that would be going up in the Los Angeles area, some like case study house number 8, on a site specifically bought for the purpose. But actually they're all over Los Angeles and the wider area. And they would be given a feature in the magazine. They would then be open to the public. So both the magazine and the architect would get lots and lots of publicity and perhaps lots and lots of clients and commissions, as well as good magazine sales. And the series continues until 1962. This is at the Pierre Court. The Charles and Ray Eames is the one you all know. Koning's Case Study House 21. I think this is the classic. Single story, very simple, thin steel, big windows, clear planes, incredibly influential on young Norman Foster and Richard Rogers, quite blatantly. The shallow pool, the carport, the sun lounger, it has the lot. And in Britain, we didn't have the steel really to make it possible. And Atkinson and Walker producing this little house for a Leicester industrialist. I think using mainly brick. Its rationing of building materials is still happening private until November 1954. It's a very key date. Until November 1954, materials were controlled by building licenses. So you have build a private house, but it was only 1,000 square feet, later 1,500 square feet. By 54, you might have got away with 2,000 square feet, tiny. So there's the garage, the master bedroom, the living room, no corridors. You come straight into the living room, the kitchen's there. The only corridor is in the children's wing, which is separate. This is where houses start to change. Single story, separated children's and grown-ups areas. These kitchen screens with the little hatch, very popular. You see how sort of semi-open plan with just the fireplace or breaking up the space. Still more clearly, I think you see in this great house by Peter Womersley for his brother John, near Huddersfield, textile family. John works in furniture. So these houses, he has a series of houses commissioned from architect brother Peter that are kind of show homes as well. And this frame is timber, but you've got local stone, you've got brick, you've got sort of panels, you've got formica here, you've got plants acting as a room divider. So this is looking from the direction of the previous photograph taken by my colleague James Davis from Historic England, who took some fantastic photographs for 2 books we did together. There's a radiator there acting as the barrier in case the kids fall down the stairs. There's a motorbike revving up outside. I hope it's not disturbing your enjoyment of this. That barrier gets put in slightly later as 2 small little Womersley nieces appear. And this is looking back the other way, and you can see the marble fireplace. You see how the living room has the timber sprung floor. This is Yorkshire slate. The planting box separates off the slightly lower dining space behind. Heating bill of something like 50 quid a day. And this house received a lot of publicity recently with Shelley Klein's book, which was serialized on Radio 4. Again, single story, timber frame, but you can see the growing similarities to Koning or what the Californian architects were doing. And Womersley's picking up sources from Italy and America. But I think his houses kind of summarize as the whole movement of post-war architecture from that very mixed material festival style of Farnley Hay to this rather Mesian style, I suppose is the easiest way of calling it, of his mid-period works. Klein, who worked in textiles, saw Farnley Hay, commissioned Womersley, and Womersley picked up another commission in the borders and moves up to Galashiels and settles there. He eventually moves off to work in Hong Kong for a bit, but never really gets the acclaim that he deserves. And we very much hope that Neil Jackson will write a book for us for the 20th Century Architects series. Here's the inside. It's because the building is low, to make a big space seem well proportioned, instead of going up, you go down. Or what the American architect Betty Cadbury Brown, who married Jim Cadbury Brown, quite obviously, called her passion pit. Their house at Aldborough had one. And the source is, I think, John Intenzer's own house, case study number 9, in next door to the Eames house, in fact, in the Pacific Palisades. Building had not only free planning, but where you have 2 stories, putting the living space on the upper floor to have the best of the views. Why not bring back the idea of the piano nobile and stick the garage and the kids' bedrooms and the guest bedroom and a workshop underneath? One house that does this particularly well is Peter Moro's own house, where all the main spaces are on the first floor and projecting out with garage, guest bedroom, and quite big workshop on the ground floor. And then upstairs you have this free plan made possible by the arrival of central heating. There are no servants, so you haven't got anybody to hide away from. Again, Robin Day furniture, library, little studio on this left-hand side. Then up steps, there's a clerestory runs through, expressing that space externally and bringing light into the deep plan. Dining space, kitchen, and all these reliefs were made by Moro himself. And he even dressed in these sorts of colours. He usually wore a black shirt and a white tie. Very sombre, but the wrong way round. Materials, shells for that light structure. Compare this, which is really very simple indeed, series of arches, a bus station by Oliver Hill. So architects from before the war, really. Britain plaque on those votes of any building erected in the 1940s for a competition held as part of the Festival of Britain, with the shell concrete, this light, broad frame for a bus depot. It's near Ringway Airport, and all these cars owners have gone on holiday, which are they're stored here near the airport. And then I think the greatest of them all, Stockwell Bus Garage, A.D. Button Partners, and these shells again. It's that concrete can be used strong, even though it's only 2, 3, 4 inches thick, if it's got a shape to it, a cone, a cylinder, a hyperbolic paraboloid where you get 2 ends up, 2 ends down, like the former Commonwealth Institute of Beloved Memory. And there's a large beam here that's stopping the whole thing spreading out too far. Markets use the same structure. Markets had been very important during the war when shops had been bombed. Street markets rather kept Britain going. So all the bombed cities like Plymouth and Coventry and Exeter, as well as most of the new towns, had very big market halls. Plymouth was the first to really get off the ground with its rebuilding, with the Royal Parade, and you see here stone with these big frame windows and the use of relief decoration. And again here, again on Royal Parade. Coventry used the sculpture even more. The car industry produced a lot of revenue, rates income for Coventry. So 1946, it planning rebuilding, which gets off to the start with this plaque by Trevor Tennant called the Levelling Stone. It's really a symbol that everything's going to be beautifully aligned and that this is going to trigger off everything being straight and proper and beautiful. But it's just a sort of symbol by act, because there wasn't actually the money and materials to build anything. But you see, a guide to the redevelopment operations by the Redevelopment Committee, 1945-6. And there they all are, names immortalised. And here, Coventry councillors are taken to Rotterdam to see the Lindbaan, which is the first pedestrian street. There it is, I think like day before New Year's Eve. Apologies for the photograph. But it inspired them to actually, the Coventry, to also have a pedestrian precinct at a time when traffic accidents were really just beginning, with this still rather classical, quite heavy architecture on the first phase, the upper precinct, but with murals by Fred Millett, who also worked on the Hertfordshire schools. This was originally the Locarno Dance Hall, and it's now the City Library. And I think best of all, Trevor Tennant was a friend of the city architect Donald Gibson, and he produced Lady Godiva, who rides her horse naked through shielded only by very long hair in strategic places, as a sort of rates protest in medieval Coventry. But and nobody looks except Peeping Tom, who pops out on the hour to see what's going on. And here you see it all closed off, and there's the proper figure of Godiva. And this the sort of start of the precinct here. And again, this is the first bit to be developed. Still quite classical, isn't it? Apart from the decoration and, of course, clock tower. But as was even quite traditional, was the sort of symbol of Coventry's resurrection after its bombing in 1940. The cathedral won in competition in 51, the rival to the Festival Hall as the great mid-century building. You can see the Epstein sculpture there, how Spence united the bombed out shell here, which is left symbolically, with a new cathedral at right angles using the same stone. I think the red stone sort of harks back to Spence's native Scotland very heavily. And then inside, you've got Graham Sutherland's tapestry. I would love a Hans Coper, candlestick, and there's Elizabeth Frink's Lecton Eagle, and all this by Spencer's office here. And looking back the other way from the altar, stained glass, Lawrence Lee, Geoffrey Clark, John Hutton. You can see a little bit of that there where the flash hasn't blown it out completely. And this delicate roof, again, very thin, engineered by Uwe Arup and partners. This has been demolished, but I think very simple, austere church, still very longitudinal with churches. There's not a lot changing in terms of liturgical planning through the 50s, but the shapes are quite organic. This has been demolished. What survives is the first public theatre, built with rates money, the same legislation that also gave us the Royal Festival Hall, and the Halfpenny Act in 1948 allowed local authorities at last to build theatres, concert halls, and places of public for music and drama, without being previously the thought to be too great a rival to the private sector, but the private sector more or less disappeared, and of course disappears completely at the face of television. To end with, the sort of fun side of this style, the Pavilion Restaurant by the photographer Angus McBean was a restaurant to the Academy Cinema, and it was demolished in 1987, just as post-war listing was being proposed. So it was recorded by the then Royal Commission, now part of Historic England, but it's gone. You can just see Oxford Street out here. A lot of the architects like Trevor Dannett, who worked on the festival, went on to do shops and particularly coffee bars. The Gadger machine first comes to Soho, it's said 1952. Terence Conran produces the Orrery. This is a page from a couple of pages from a long defunct magazine called The Architecture and Building that went bust in 1960. And a lot of art people, Humphrey Spender was designing coffee bars. Conran, of course, goes on to do Habitat, working with architects, landscape people, with the use of interior planting, a real prominent feature. Pubs really not built in any quantity before the restrictions come off in 1954. Never turn back was a saying of the Caister-on-Sea lifeboat, which sank in 1901, and the pub, which had been burned down in 1940, is rebuilt as a memorial and given this name. But you could see the jolliness of the exterior. And on the seaside, how to perfect timing, I think, to be thinking of ice cream, where it is now raining in Islington has seriously gone dark. Morelli's in Broadstairs, 1932, but refronted and given this sort of Chevrolet bumper to its front in 1957-8. Would love to know the architect. A lot of remodelling inside, but you can see the Lloyd room chairs and so forth. Piers were all cut in half, part demolished so that they wouldn't become landing stages for invading Germans in 1940. So they all get rebuilt in the 50s. And I think the most distinctive is Boscombe, with this wonderful swooping canopy. It's just like two kiosks and then two more added on the side, and the lavatories behind. But the shape, the boomerang, is fantastic, and again shows the power of a good simple concrete cantilever. But I think perhaps nothing beats the lemon squeeze on Douglas seafront, where the jetty for incoming ferries from Huyton and Liverpool. So this is your first or your last sight of Douglas as you wend your weary way back to Britain. To conclude, how architecture then starts to get more serious from the end of the 1950s as more materials are being built. One of the things that I can never get my head round is how we go from austerity and the sort of simplicity and the shortage of materials suddenly into a great boom of building in the years, say, 1958-62. Plymouth Civic Centre really says it all. This is the council chambers, you can see Hans Tisdale murals on the walls. They're like a tapestry, so they have an acoustic property as well as a decorative one. And Hans Tisdale worked on the festival, but made on Battersea Park, the fun fair element, which I've not had time to go into. Geoffrey Jellicoe, by this time becoming known as a landscape architect, his background was in made his first name in public housing in the war. But as He was on the Royal Society, Royal Fine Arts Committee, and in questioning the design by H.W.J. Hector Sterling, he'd ended up being asked to take over the job with something rather underhand. If you look at the outside, how you're starting to move away from the mix of materials, you're getting into a more rigid. You've still got the thin out feature for the water tank on the roof there. So this is a building that's sort of half and half. Stevenage Town Centre, a movement still away from the picturesque. You've still got lots of colour, but you've got quite a strong 5-foot grid, giving a homogeneity to your pedestrian precinct. Begun after Coventry, but finished first. And glorious relief by Fantabelski. And then on the opposite side, out of the other side of the square, you couldn't see in the first picture, this was the Co-op with a tile mural by a Hungarian artist called Julia Baggio, who had connections to the Stoke pottery industry, which I suppose is where the ceramic tiles come from. But it has that Eastern European sort of strong figures and very profound sort of sturdy structural quality. The curtain wall is something that Britain does very well. It sort of slips between mid-century modern and something higher, a sort of later, more serious phase, but it still has that lightness. And in Pilkingtons, Britain had one of the foremost glass manufacturers in the world. Steel still in short supply until the mid-60s, but lots of aluminium for producing these frames. I think here you tend to have a steel frame, but with aluminium sections for some of the glazing. And this is a current 20th century society case. It's up for total demolition. And I think it's an important, again, American inspired, but a very good example by a firm, Collins Melvin Ward, who did curtain walls better than anybody else, and very little of their work survives unaltered. I think Sheffield University, and that's more or less it. And the building of technical colleges and secondary schools and comprehensive schools was sort of the work of the 1950s. Then at the end of the 50s, as more kids were staying on at school, the baby boom of the 1940s were getting older and starting to need secondary and then potentially university places. So the architecture grows up with them. And you start to see, I think, a sort of second flowering of post-war modern architecture, of it coming of age. You know, this is the building that really marks that. Still a simple curtain wall building, it's still on a relatively tight budget, but Jacobson's Grade 1 St. Catherine's College at Oxford, with this delicious landscape, all and furniture, you know, every detail by the great man, is marking something more permanent. This modernism is not just a temporary fad that once the austerity is over, we'll go back to doing Scandinavian, Neo-Georgian. No, modernism is seriously of its time and here to last 400 years and reflect its age just as the medieval colleges of Oxford and Cambridge reflected their age. That was the brief. Actually for Churchill College, Cambridge, but it's as valid for St. Catherine's. And Powell and Moyer, who you saw doing Skylon, come to the same maturity with their addition to Brasenose College, which has stone mixed in with concrete, lead, still a plethora of materials, but the proportions are now, I think, fairly golden section. They're quite classical with odd little canters, but the thing has a calmness, elegance, serenity, just as the present day facade of the Royal Festival Hall has a serenity compared with that of the 1951 image. And I finish with whatever happened to. I started with my initial slide with Nadasa's 51 bar, with Daphne Hardy Henrian's figure of youth outside it. And I mentioned too that most of the sculpture from the Festival of Britain ended up in an Arts Council store, never to be seen again. All except one. And how then it got it out, and how it suddenly disappeared from the lists and accounts of the Arts Council buildings, the minutes, which I've gone through quite carefully, and all the records don't tell. 1 minute, it's there, the next minute, it's gone. But look at Leonard's house. This is Leonard Manasseh's own house. It had to be a 2-story house, but he had 5 kids. So the attic is big. It's still got brick, it's still got sculpture, it's got landscaping, it's got decoration, but the concrete floors are beginning to be expressed. The whole thing is a little bit more expressive, a little bit chunkier. And when I see you, or don't see you, you see me, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to go into the whole seedy, meaty question of brutalism. Thank you all very much. Sorry I've gone on, as usual, far too long. Hi, everyone. Earth calling Peter.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Elaine.
Lovely messages, everyone.
Right, Elaine, there are a few questions. Would you take those?
Please.
While people are here, would you mind listing again the 5 characteristics of modern architecture points that you talked about at the beginning?
Sorry, I was going fast because I thought, well, Alan did them all properly last week. And of course, such an erudite audience would remember. But just in case, so you have your flat roof, you have your long strip windows, you have a free plan because the reinforcement's supposed to let you put the windows anywhere. So that means you could have a free plan or open plan on the inside, and the walls don't necessarily have to follow each other through the floors. And you have pilotti. Peter's still looking baffled. Flat roof, strip windows, free facade, free plan, and pilotti. We'll test you all at the end.
That's it. And I think there's one other question. Which sculpture did Manchester take from the festival?
I'd have to run and look it up.
There was one that went to Manchester.
It's a Karen Jonsson piece. But if you look in our journal, the one I did the little advert for, they're all listed there. I'll run and get it. Hang on. Talk amongst yourselves.
Fine. I can answer Rosemary's question, which is the grade A listing is what is in Scotland, where they use a slightly different system.
Yeah, Scotland has, I think it's a good system. Their grade A is like our 1 and 2 star. So it's like their top 10%. Then they have a B, which is our grade 2. And then they have a C, which is group value, buildings that are perhaps of lesser interest, like the stables to a country house, or something that's slightly subordinate. But that's very rough. They have a CS, which seems to be a grade 2 as well. So that gets confusing. Now, where's the sculpture chapter? Oh, page 96. It's you.
When Elaine sorted that, there was another interesting question, I thought, which it's very nice to say. I think we're all aware of the excellent work that C20 and Elaine does at EH, but do you feel this period of architecture has adequate statutory protection? And do we need to be far enough away from it, I guess historically, to properly appreciate it?
I think we're now far enough away. I think it was difficult when listing first started in the 1980s, 87. So, I mean, it's more than 30 years ago now, that there was a lot more interest in smart architecture, the Arne Jacobsens, the sort of cool, the approved look. You know, Peter Moro was all right, Basil Spence was all right, but the Rivoli Ballroom in South London or the Pier at Boscombe were definitely not all right. And it's a good job that Douglas Isle of Man is not in England. We wouldn't, you know. So those sorts of really festival things didn't get a look in. But in the last decade, I think the Walthamstow, the central buildings was listed in 2015, the ballroom was listed in 2007, and it's become, in some ways, there's been more enthusiasm for that sort of lighter 50s mid-century modern style. The battles are still going on over brutalism or anything that's sort of a mix of style or is really very, very austere indeed. Anything that's got decoration or a technical interest, I feel gets through. That's my personal opinion, not a broad historic England one.
I mean, Elaine, I think there's been a bit of a problem about getting protection for Miesian style buildings. I mean, there are very, very few in London that have got listing, and they're all now sort of at least probably 55, 60, 65 years old. So I think it's been very, very difficult to get those protected. I can only think of a handful, if that, and an awful lot that have gone, say, in the last 20 years. And we certainly we've lost a few battles on that, I'm afraid.
Oh, right. I can think of examples, because the problem, I think there's still the expectation that these things have to be listable, they have to be exceptionally complete, even if they're then all to be listed building consent. And as soon as you make any change to a Miesian building, because they're so minimal, it's stuffed. And that's been a real problem. Yeah. The sculpture I was thinking of is a Karen Jonsson called Figure Symbolising Youth, and it was in Manchester, but it's now in the Liverpool Walker Art Gallery. So that could explain the confusion for our audience.
Well, thank you, Elaine, and that was fantastic. Next week, we've got Alan Powers again on Neo-Georgian, perhaps a slightly more obscure period as for many of us, but I'm sure Alan will do a fantastic job in explaining that to us in great detail. If you've enjoyed it, thank you very much. We'd love to have you as a member. You can find out how to join on our website. And if you are a member, we'd really like to have a donation to help us with the casework, which I think you've got a feel for this evening that we need to do, and it needs support. And again, you can do that on the action page on our website. And without further ado, thank you very much for coming along this evening. And again, another zoomed round of applause for Elaine.
A big round of applause for you all for coming as well. And I'll virtually see you all in 2 weeks. And thanks again for such amazing comments. Bye-bye.